The following is a chilling story of how a geologist in the Arctic who had separated from his research team to find samples ended up being mercilessly mauled to death by a hungry polar bear after a long and terrifying chase in the Arctic snow. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying polar bear attack on Stephen Riley. Welcome to Final Affliction. Researcher Stephen Riley had been deployed in the Arctic Circle to investigate the melting ice caps and the impact of global warming on the wild and marine life in the frozen vast expanse. Stephen had always wanted to witness the northern lights in the night sky, so he was glad that he got the chance to be there at just the time when Aurora Borealis is most clearly visible. It was a serene, heavenly place away from the distractions of life. He and his team had been staying at a caravan trailer parked a few miles from where they needed the samples. For the week that they stayed at the site, the night sky would sometimes be a clear, star-studded window into outer space, and other times a spectacular display of colors in the sky from the Aurora Borealis. But inhabiting this beautiful place were beasts that had seldom encountered humans. The most ferocious of these is the polar bear. At over 2 meters in height and weighing more than 1,000 pounds, these mammals were comfortable at the top of the Arctic food chain, feeding on everything from seals, walruses, and even beluga whales. However, global warming and the melting of the polar ice caps had been depleting the natural marine life of the area, and polar bears were starting to go long stretches of time hungry and without hunting. Stephen Riley finally got a chance to witness the northern lights about a week into their research trip, and he took several photographs of the beautiful display before returning to his caravan. In contact with his supervisor over the phone, Stephen was instructed to collect more samples of the thinning ice a few miles from their caravan. He was frustrated with his supervisor and tried to explain that the lack of marine life in this frozen wasteland was enough evidence that the ice was thinning due to global warming. The supervisor on the phone refused to budge and ordered him to collect and bring back more samples for research. Stephen angrily hung up the phone and decided to get it over with by going out into the freezing cold and getting the ice samples himself. He chose a site about a few kilometers from their caravan for the ice samples, but the foot-deep snow and blazing cold winds made it extremely difficult and time-consuming to walk there. He had no choice but to bring back the samples, which he thought would prove to his supervisors that he was right all along. Global warming had caused ice sheets on the water to melt and crack, leaving floating islands of ice separated by several feet of freezing water. Stephen had to hop from one sheet to the next and slowly make his way to the chosen site. He finally identified an appropriate spot to chisel off a piece of ice on the edge of the floating sheet. He crouched down and took out his tools for the job. Hunched over right on the cusp of the ice-cold water, he heard light splashes followed by a grunt. He couldn't get a good view of what it was and dismissed the sound for a whale or seal beneath the water. He heard the grunt again, and this time it sounded louder and closer. He realized it was not coming from beneath the water, but from behind him. He turned back and spotted a massive body of white fur over 7 feet tall right as it jumped to him. Frightened out of his senses, he instinctively ducked and felt the sharp claws of the animal scratch his shoulder as it plunged into the water on the other side. Stephen quickly realized the vulnerability of his circumstance. He had no transportation, no weapon, and no communication to contact his colleagues at the camp. He was alone in the vast frozen wasteland several miles away from safety, and all he had was a small can of bear spray in his backpack. He had only a few seconds to frantically search for it with his freezing and jittery cold hands before the polar bear clambered out of the water and ran after him once again. From the weight of the massive bear jumping at Stephen, the floating ice sheet wobbled and tilted, further throwing him off. He spotted the head of the beast coming out of the water as he unzipped his bag and rummaged through it trying to find the spray can. He finally found it and immediately turned around to spray the bear that was now charging right toward him. The intense and pungent smell of the chemicals inside the bear spray threw it off momentarily as it turned around and jumped back into the water. Stephen realized he had just bought himself a few more seconds to escape. He dropped his bag where it was and made a run for the caravan as fast as he could. The adrenaline was pumping, his heart was beating fast as he jumped from one ice sheet to the next, spraying the can behind him as he went. In desperation and the pain from his wound, he slipped on the sheet of ice and dropped the bear spray, which landed right in the water. He didn't have the time to recover it or the heart to look back, so he continued running as fast as possible in the direction of his caravan. As he ran, he tripped again on the edge of an ice sheet while trying to jump from one to the next. This time, he plunged into the water. The icy cold water drained him of any heat or energy that Steven's body had retained by this point, as he splashed around trying to get back up on his feet. However, before he could even get out of the water, he noticed the loud growls of the bear swimming behind him. His hands and legs numb from the freezing water made it much harder for him to get up and run. He let out a scream in terror. The bear got out of the water behind him and charged at Steven. A terrifying, huge mass of fur. The sight of the predator running towards him with vicious intent numbed his senses. He was barely able to crawl now. With the caravan only a half a kilometer away, he tried desperately to scream to his colleagues at the campsite, but to no avail. The bear finally caught up to him, and by this time, the bear spray had been washed off its nose from swimming in the water. Now, there was nothing that could stop Steven from being eaten alive by the hungry polar bear. He was left defenseless, numb, and terrified out of his senses. The bear stood up on its 2 hind feet and then slammed its 2 front feet straight onto Steven's neck, snapping it in half. Steven's fate was now sealed. The bear ripped its claws into his torso and neck, and he could only let out a slight squeal in his final moments before being devoured by the bear piece by piece. All that was later found by his colleagues at the spot was a few torn clothes, some bones and flesh, and a reddened spot in the white snow that told the tale of Steven's final affliction.